Welcome everyone to Time4Action's 6th webinar. Our vision is to spread the word about progressive ideas around the climate crisis, and that's been the way we've decided how to set up the webinars. Today I'm quite excited about who we've got. 3 guests, all very knowledgeable about banking and the climate crisis. Anyway, thanks for everyone who's joined. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that my colleagues, Kathleen O'Hara and Rolly Montpellier, are on the unceded traditional territories of the Algonquin peoples, and we thank them for letting us be here. So today we have 3 guests, one from the Netherlands, Maaike Benes, and she works with a group called BankTrack, which we'll get to know a lot more about. And she's been working with them since November of 2020. However, before that, she worked for the peace organization PAX, which holds financial institutions accountable for their investments in nuclear and other controversial weapons. Next, we have Keith Stewart, who's a senior energy strategist with Greenpeace Canada and a part-time instructor at the University of Toronto. He has a PhD in political science from York University, and that's probably just what you need to do this kind of work. He's a climate policy researcher and advocate for 19 years. And finally, we have our very own Rolly Montpellier, one of our 3 of us that are Time4Action. Rolly is a co-founder and editor of Below 2C. Many of you will know about that. And he's also with the group Fossil Banks No Thanks, Canadian BankTrack kind of a offspring, I think. And of course, he's a valuable member of our Time4Action group. So we're going to start with Rolly's going to show 5 or 6 slides of key slides about the banking industry and how they're investing in the fossil fuel industry. And then Kathleen's going to ask questions of Keith and Maaike for about half an hour, 25 minutes or half an hour. Then I'm going to ask some questions, and Rolly may help with some questions from the audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A. And then we'll finish with Rolly talking about actions in Canada around the no thanks fossil banks. I don't know. Kathleen, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Welcome to everyone. I'm here to introduce Rolly again, and sorry. So over to you, Rolly.
So Ken, you'll show the slides?
I'm getting them up now.
Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Yes, I'll be going through about 5 or 6 slides, I guess. And that first slide that you're looking at is the cover page of the report, Banking on Climate Change 2020. And you can see at the bottom of the slide the 6 different organizations which are authors of this report. This report comes out annually and has been for several years now. The 2021 report will be coming out soon. And Maaike Benes, who's one of the panelists today, is with BankTrack, which is one of the organizations you'll see at the bottom of the slide. And I believe she's one of the authors, one of the writers of this year's report. The Banking on Climate Change report, I've shared a link in the chat. I'll share it again. And it's a very, very comprehensive report on how fossil fuels are financing climate change, or financing the climate crisis, by virtue of the fact that they are lenders, or well, financiers, I suppose, but they are funding fossil fuel infrastructure that goes from oil and gas and coal and fracking and pipelines. So anything that has to do with fossil fuel production. And I believe this particular report, the 2020 report, deals with some 2,000 companies that are, we reviewed some 2,000 companies that are funded by 35 global banks. So, and the next slides will highlight some of the major findings of the report. And Maaike might have something else to add later. This particular slide sort of, speaks for itself. The 35 banks have shoveled $2.7 trillion in fossil fuels only since the Paris Agreement was signed back in 2016. And as we know, the Paris Agreement, under the Paris Agreement, some 190 countries pledged to reduce their emissions by 2030, while our banks themselves have spent $2.7 trillion more on fossil fuel producing activities since Paris Agreement. So obviously going in the wrong direction. Next slide.
Sorry, Rolly, I don't know why it won't there.
Okay. Yes, and I mentioned 2.7 trillion. That is the cumulative total of 2016 to 2019. But you can see it's been going up each year, and I can't wait to see the 2021 report because my suspicion is that it will be even higher than the 2019. Yeah, so, and at this rate, we will be, the banks will be financing $1 trillion per year in fossil fuels. Again, in the opposite direction that we have to be heading into based on the Paris Agreement. Next slide. So we always like to talk about the dirty dozen. Now, the worst banks since the Paris Agreement. You know, us Canadians are pretty smug and thinking, well, it's all these other big banks that are doing this. Well, not really. So this is a chart that shows, I think it's that dirty dozen, 12 banks. And I placed arrows on the left that shows RBC being 5th overall, TD being 8th, and Scotiabank being 10th. And if I had the top 20 here instead of the dirty dozen, that would also pick up the MO. What am I missing? CIBC. So 3 of our big banks are in the top 10, which is absolutely disgusting when I found this out. And I've added this some writing on the bottom right. Since Paris, Canada's big 5 banks have financed over $500 billion globally. And in Canada, they finance about 70% of all the tar sands expansion. So our tar sands are being supported by our banks, our big banks, to the tune of 70% of all the financing involving in that particular venture. Next.
Sorry, Rolly, it's not moving for some reason. Just a minute.
Okay. Yes, now this is, if you were falling asleep by now, this chart will wake you up. It's pretty bright. And this is courtesy of our friends at XR Quebec when they launched their campaign. That was it was the Quit RBC campaign some months ago. They had this chart out, and one of the graphics they used, and again, it shows these 5 stacks which represent our 5 big banks, from RBC on the left to CIBC on the right. Each color is a different year, and just another way of saying what I said with the previous slides, that and that little box that you see that says globally we produce, this is a very interesting stat, globally we produce 5% of the world's oil. We're a small country, 5% of the world's oil, but our banks hold 17.5% of the world's fossil fuel financing since 2015. So we have a government that kind of prides itself, or has proclaimed itself, a world leader on climate, while Canada's 5 big banks, big 5 banks, now have increased their financing of world fossil fuel financing. Sorry, they haven't increased it. They own 17.5% of fossil fuel financing since 2015. So all the increase since 2015, 17.5% is from Canada, in spite of the fact we're only 5% of the world's oil. So I thought that was a very staggering statistic, really. Next, Ken. This is just another way of showing it, stacking the banks from top to bottom, 140, 103, 97, 82. It adds up to the 600 and some billion, as I said before. This particular graphic is from Bank Switch. You'll see at the bottom, and I'll talk about Bank Switch a little bit later. Next, Ken. And just to reinforce what I've said already, 70% of tar sands expansion is from the big five. And here it shows ED, RB as the top financier of the tar sands, the top lender, I should say. And RBC is second. The third largest bank in the tar sands is JP Morgan. But the next three after that, if this showed 6 banks, the next three after that would be the other 3 Canadian banks. In other words, BMO, Scotia, and CIBC. So of the top 6 banks financing the tar sands, 5 of the top 6 are big 5 banks. And I think that completes, I'm just looking to the right here. Yes, that completes the slide. So these findings are from the report. And again, I will put another, let me just check. Yes, I'll add the link in the chat again. And perhaps Maaike will have more to add about the climate change report later on in the web. Back to you, Ken.
Okay, thanks, Rolly. Kathleen, I muted you because we were getting a bit of echo, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, Rolly. Thank you, Ken, for muting me. And welcome to viewers, and welcome especially to our 2 guests, Maaike and Keith. Maaike, I'd like to start with a bit more background on BankTrack, because it sounds like it's just doing fabulous research. It must be quite a challenge. You're doing it every year. Can you just give us a bit more details about your group?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kathleen and Ken. It's really nice to be here. It's evening for me, but it's always really nice to talk with people on the other side of the ocean. So BankTrack is quite a small NGO in the Netherlands. We're just over 10 people, and we're a group that focuses on commercial banks around the world. And then in our research and in our activism, we focus on issues that include climate change, and then mostly fossil fuels, but also deforestation and soft commodities, and on human rights. So myself, I am a climate campaigner, and in the climate project, we focus on mostly on fossil fuels. And the BOCC, the Banking on Climate Change report, is one of our major projects. And I think, of course, a research like this we produce in coalition. So Rolly already mentioned in total 6 organizations that together produce this research. And for us, it's part of sort of all of the different aspects to our work. So on the one hand, you have research, but research on its own never changes anything. But it can be a really valuable tool for ourselves when we talk to banks in our engagement with banks, but also for other groups that can use the data that we provide for their own activism. So over the years, I think it's going to be the 12th year that the research will be produced. It's become quite an authoritative source for groups around the world to use when they target banks. So the research part is one of the most important activities that we do at BankTrack. And it's not just a BOCC report. We also maintain a website that is basically a really big database with information about commercial banks and the projects and companies that they finance. And that is also a place where we really try to support others who want to, for example, if you are a customer of RBC, you can go to our website and see what kind of dirty deals that they are involved in.
I think, Maaike, Ken is going to look at RBC in detail after our interview. So that'll be great because it's very detailed, and I love your dodgy deals section. Keith, I just wondered how banks fit into the general Greenpeace action agenda.
So I mean, banks are important because they enable a lot of other activities to happen. And so at Greenpeace Canada, we've worked on banks before, and Greenpeace globally has done a lot of work on banks with various commodities, etc. But here in Canada, I think it's really important to remember that it was actually about 12 years ago that Rainforest Action Network and the Indigenous Environment Network first started a campaign to get RBC out of the tar sands. And that was sort of the first big push on banks and fossil fuels that I'm aware of in Canada. Could have been before. Sometimes the history of these things gets lost. And Greenpeace Canada was sort of supporting that campaign back then. In 2017 and 2018, we were running a campaign to try and get Canadian banks, and particularly focused on TD because they were the principal bank, to not finance the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. And we actually got a bunch of European banks to commit to not funding tar sands pipelines generally, like sort of put that into their policy statements, and a bunch of other investors as well. No Canadian banks sort of took that bait. And that campaign then sort of like the challenge we ran into was it was actually going quite well, and the pipeline company ended up walking away because they saw it as too much risk, no reward. But then, of course, the government of Canada bought the pipeline and is building it, and they don't need to rely on bank financing. They can rely on money from you and I. So sort of that campaign, we sort of wrapped that up, but we're currently actually looking at launching a much broader campaign on getting banks to stop funding fossil fuels. There's similar campaigns running that Greenpeace is a part of in Canada, the UK, Australia. Sorry, US, UK, Australia. And we're actually in the middle of working on a report, which is using much of the same data, well, basically the same database as the Bank Track RAND report, but it'll just be on the Canadian banks. So it'll be more specific on them. And it's going to sort of include what they're financing, but also we're getting the sort of like the nerds that we're hiring to write the report to do an assessment of the exposure of Canadian banks to stranded assets, to what's sometimes called transition risks in a 1.5 degree scenario. So if we are successful in keeping warming to 1.5 degrees, how much money do the banks lose under their current policies and portfolios? Because we want to sort of start putting that on the agenda, that this is actually a huge risk for them, because they just look at it as a moneymaker. So I think that's some of the specific work, but I think if we're looking at banks more broadly, there's really, I think, at least two important ways to look at it. One around the economics and the politics. And banks are more important now than they were 10 years ago for the oil industry, because the price of oil is down, and banks used to be able to rely on retained earnings. Like they were so profitable, they didn't have to rely that much on banks to finance their activities. I mean, they did, but it wasn't sort of as crucial as now, because now, I mean, you have companies like ExxonMobil, which are actually borrowing money from banks to pay dividends, to pay their shareholders, because they're losing money. So banks they're kind of on life support, and the banks are the things that are keeping them going. And that puts them in a much more vulnerable place. And politically, in Canada, and many other places around the world as well, but there's been this alliance between financial capital, fossil capital, between the banks and the oil companies. And, they've seen each other as having a common agenda. What's good for the oil industry is good for banks, it's good for Canada. That's the way I think they saw the world. And that's been incredibly powerful in this country, because banks are incredibly powerful, so are oil companies, in limiting government policy, but also limiting our political imagination about what possible futures are there and what's a reasonable thing to do. And I think there's an opportunity right now, if we can sort of get really good campaigns going involving lots of people, to actually split the banks and the oil companies so that they are no longer moving in lockstep. And that opens up all sorts of political possibilities that don't seem to be there right now, but we can make them happen.
Well, speaking of stranded assets, Maaike, why do you think, having studied these banks, why are they, especially after the Paris Agreement, sticking their necks out like this? I mean, the end is nigh, and why are they making these huge investments? What's your take on that?
I think what is one of the biggest problems is sort of the time frame of risk that you look at. And for banks, that is often, if you're lucky, 5 years. Whereas for climate change, we're talking about, it is urgent now, but it's still a slightly longer time frame. The world is not going to end in 5 years. That would probably change their decisions. So I think one of the biggest problems is that the banking sector is still incentivizing really short-term decision-making. And also people that work at the banks are rewarded in line with that. And I think what regulators are also trying to change a little bit is that banks start to incorporate those risks into their reporting. And once banks start to report on it, it becomes easier to pressure them on it. But I think it's still a really big problem that they, if they can make money tomorrow, they will not let that opportunity pass. And the risk of climate change impacting the profits of banks is one risk, but something that we have a lot more control over is also the reputational risk. And we can make that happen tomorrow. So that's always where I put a lot of my hopes, is that ordinary folks can just, make sure that RBC and TD are really struggling with their reputation, and that will influence their decisions tomorrow.
Well, actually, that leads me to my next question. I saw a video by a woman, a French woman from Reclaim Finance, and she had a list of 4 what she called bullshit, bank bullshit, greenwashing points, and they were fabulous. I mean, for example, TD calls itself carbon neutral when it's the largest tar sands investor. Keith, can you talk about that, about greenwashing in Canada?
The greenwashing is a long tradition where you make claims that you're environmentally friendly when you're not. And I think a key example is things like, banks say, oh, well, we buy green electricity or we buy offsets for the electricity that we use for the lights in our branch office. So we're not contributing to climate change, which is ridiculous because, I mean, that's a tiny portion of their contribution. Their main contribution is the tens of billions of dollars that they're pumping into this industry to keep it going. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that coming because the Canadian banks, they know there's a campaign coming at them. There's one now, it's going to get bigger, it's going to get stronger. They're looking what's happening in Europe and other places. And so they're trying to get out in front and saying things like, oh, we're going to be we have an aspiration to be net zero. We don't have any, but they don't have any details on what they're going to do in the near term. So net zero by 2050. And first of all, what do they mean by net zero? Often they think it just means we can plant a lot of trees and just keep on with business as usual. But also they're not putting forward yet any intermediate steps saying, you want to do something in 2050. Again, banks have a 5-year time horizon. 5 years is long term for them. So when they say something's going to happen in 2050, they're not serious. It's like, okay, what are your targets for 2025? What are your targets for 2030? Is anyone's compensation tied to achieving these targets? If the president doesn't get a bonus if they don't achieve their greenhouse gas targets, then maybe they're starting to get serious. So I think part of what we have to do is make sure that they can't get away with these kind of like phony baloney claims and advertising. Some of my colleagues in the UK, they're replacing HSBC ads with climate destruction scenes, saying this is what they're actually doing. And I think those are some of the types of things we're looking at getting involved here in Canada to just make sure that they don't get a free ride on their environmental claims.
Thanks, Keith. Maaike, what about greenwashing in Europe other than the UK? What have you seen there?
I think maybe it's interesting I was recently working on a report about Scandinavian banks, and even in the Netherlands, but I'm assuming it's the same in North America. We see the Scandinavians as such green and, I don't know, progressive people. And even there also, those banks, they really show themselves as, we give if our employees become parents, we give them really long leave, and we compensate all our employees come to work by bike, and they're really, all their logos are green. It's amazing. If you go to those websites, you think like, oh, wow. But when you investigate their investments and their policies, even those Scandinavian banks, you find that they are investing in coal companies like RWE, for example, which is a really notorious coal company. So I think, I don't know, banks cannot be trusted. Even if they look friendly, Scandinavian banks, they all do the greenwashing. But I think I'm always a very optimistic person, and I really like what Keith said also, is that you can basically also use it against them. So once they start using this rhetoric, you can start holding them to it, and we have something to pressure them with. So I think the banks are starting to feel that they cannot get away with not using that rhetoric. So now that they've started to make the promises, let's just hold them to it.
Yeah, I think Rolly actually is going to post some examples of greenwashing in the chat. But it also makes me wonder how many Canadians or Europeans have any idea about, have you got any sense how many people realize they're being lied to, basically? Do you get any sense, Keith, about what Canadians think of their banks? Do they have any idea about these investments?
I think most Canadians don't know about kind of the banks, how deeply involved they are in fossil fuels. Because when you go to the bank, you don't think, oh, this is, there's no smokestack coming out of the bank branch.
Mm.
And the banks themselves try and, separate out, what they're doing in one place with the image when you walk in and you see the big green chair in the TD branch. So I think part of our job is to make sure that people recognize this connection. They see the role the banks are playing, and that puts more pressure on the banks to change, because we know that there are pressures from inside the banks, particularly for some of their younger employees who don't want to be part of financing climate destruction. And I think we need to sort of kind of foment some internal dissent there. But also just like, making sure people are aware of what's happening, and also saying, some of this is your money. You are being involved in this probably without your knowledge and probably against your desires. So, let's send that message clearly to the particularly the big five banks in Canada, because they are major global players. So, as Rolly was showing, these guys aren't just big in Canada; they are amongst the biggest banks in the world for financing this kind of stuff.
Maaike, any idea if Europeans have any sense of what's happening with their money?
My sense is that people don't generally trust banks. There was a polling recently where people's trust in different institutions, going from like mainstream media to politics, but also banks, was measured. And I think like only 50% had some sort of confidence in their bank. And also, if I talk to people around me, it feels like everybody thinks, banks are just going to do bad stuff. That's just what banks do. So people sort of know about the fraud that happens, and also the financing of controversial issues. I think the awareness around that last bit might be a bit higher in Europe. We've got quite sort of a history of NGOs publishing research about fossil fuels, but also controversial weapons, human rights violations. So it's quite generally known. Of course, the challenge is getting people to act on it. And getting people to change banks can be a little bit difficult. And I also understand that. It's a little bit easier if you ask someone to send a message to their bank once a year. And that's annoying to the bank, so we can do that.
Yeah. So, Maaike, what does BankTrack do when it starts pressuring the banks? What are the main things it says to the banks, other than pull out their money? How are you trying to keep them accountable?
I guess it's always a combination of what we call inside and outside strategies. So usually if we would identify a bank being involved in something problematic, then we would first get in touch with them and ask for a conversation. And then it depends a bit on which bank you're planning to talk to, how open they are to that. So in Northwest Europe, they always respond. But we also try to influence, for example, Chinese banks, and there's really difficult, let alone only for language reasons. So you usually start by having a conversation with people inside the bank. Sometimes it works, usually it doesn't really. Usually you then come to the conclusion that you need some outside pressure. So you need media attention, you need customers making complaints to the bank, and that will then sort of change their calculation of their interests. It becomes more annoying for them to continue doing what they were doing than to change. And that's a reason We do often do research, because then, you know, you have a really legitimate argument that you can propose to the media and to customers. And you can then use that for further public action. And that usually is necessary. So customers outside, activists outside, and media pressure. They really are annoyed by media pressure.
Yes, I don't think they get enough of it here, I must say. Keith, you've talked a bit about strategy here. Is there anything else you want to add about what we can do to influence the banks?
So, I mean, internally, we're still sort of figuring out what the next phase of our work could look like. And we're also talking to Rolly and the rest of you and sort of some other colleagues. And so I think it's one of the things we need to do is sort of start to kind of push them out of cultural spaces. They feel really comfortable. They sort of really care about their brand identity. That's a big kind of like big source of value to them, like literally like financial value. And so it's the kind of like, okay, how can we mess with their brand? In terms of, you know, whether it's ad busting their advertisements, whether it's trying to get, you know, some of their corporate sponsorships canceled, groups to say, we're not going to take your money anymore. This has been done in Europe. It's been done successfully on sort of, you know, other campaigns in Canada, where it's like, okay, if you can get, you know, someone who's being sponsored by these banks to say, well, you know, we're not going to take your money if you're funding, as long as you're not doing anything but your fossil fuel financing, then that's also a way that it kind of like it hits them where it hurts. Because the reason they give money to people, to organizations, is because it's a form of advertising, right? Like it's about building their brand. It's an investment in them making more money by getting people to think positive thoughts about them. So we're sort of starting to take a look at that, like where might be some vulnerable points. Definitely just having people speak up to their banks is useful. We've had, you know, when we were doing the campaign on TD, we had people going in, asking to talk to their bank manager. And the bank manager kind of has to agree to meet with you. And it's really annoying for them. It takes up a chunk of their day. And they're kind of like, oh God, I got all these people coming in to talk to me. Doing demonstrations, like on January 29th, there was sort of the Day of Action organized by, you know, you guys. And it was, I mean, the banks all knew you were coming. Like they had seen that, they were worried. They sort of memoed to all their staff, this is what's happening. This is how you should deal with it. And so making those types of things happen more often, and sort of like maybe even bigger and bigger scale, so it starts getting picked up by media, and it's kind of like, oh, why are people angry at banks? You know, it's, oh, because they're funding these bad projects. And so that's also why we, for instance, we've commissioned some research on Canada, because we want to have like a Canada only report, because it's just easier for people to digest. Because I mean, the bank track stuff is amazing, but there's so much information. It's kind of overwhelming when you go, it can be overwhelming when you go to their website and you start looking through all of the stuff. But it's, yeah, it's going to be people power that's going to, and trying to find those spots where they're vulnerable to kind of poke there and get the banks to just realize that it's actually going to be really painful for them to keep on with business as usual. So that's one angle. The other angle is we're also looking at things like around the Kinder Morgan pipeline, for instance, when they tried to do a share offering to create a new company to build a pipeline, private company, we challenged it with securities regulators. We said, you know, inadequate disclosure of climate risk. You might be misrepresenting what you're offering to shareholders because you haven't said what are the risks to climate change. They had to go back and rewrite their document to say, okay, if, you know, the world achieves the Paris decarbonization targets, then, you know, we'll probably lose money. And then you sort of start pushing this at the shareholders, saying, you know, you're investing in something where they're saying, if we succeed in action on climate change, we lose money. Like, did you know that they're actually saying that in those documents? Because you can't lie in those documents. That's a serious crime, fraud. So looking for opportunities like that, are there places where we can go at the banks and say, actually, you know, like some place where there's actual teeth around regulatory processes. So one of the things we're looking at with assessing the risk of a 1.5 degree scenario is to sort of say, okay, you're actually really vulnerable on this. Are you telling your shareholders that you have all of these assets currently that are at risk in a world where we've successfully kind of acted on climate change? Because if you're not telling them, then that's kind of important information they should have.
Oh, you're on mute, Kathleen.
What? Rolly, I keep getting muted. Rolly's actually going to tell us about upcoming bank AGMs, so we'll look at that. But I must say, I took part in an Extinction Rebellion die-in in front of the Royal Bank in Kingston on a sunny pre-COVID day. And I couldn't believe that I was lying on the sidewalk on the main street of Kingston. But if you want to protest in a really easy, comfortable way, do a die-in front of a bank. It's quite fun. And you could probably even do it, well, once the snow goes, with social distancing and a mask on. So I highly recommend it. Anyway, I want to wrap up with one last question. Maaike, you are preparing for COP26 in November in Glasgow. Can you just tell us quickly what you're thinking, what you're up to?
Yes. So we see sort of a trajectory towards the COP26 with that as a deadline that we can use to push banks on. So we will be launching a new version of the Banking on Climate Change report later this month, the 24th of March. And that will have a lot of new information. So the scope of banks that we look at will be increased from 35 to 60 this year.
Wow.
And we also look at 2,300 fossil fuel companies instead of 2,100, I think. So we'll have a lot of new information, and that will be almost just in time for the AGM season. So all the banks will hold their annual shareholder meetings, and folks can use the data in our reports to alert also the shareholders in the banks of this. And it's also, participating in an AGM is one thing, but using it as an opportunity to do social media campaigning and other types of actions is always really useful. And then we really just sort of want to ramp up actions for the rest of the year. Also because the COP will be an opportunity for media to report on climate change. You can already see that sort of happening. So that's a way we try to use it to get attention. And at BankTrack, we're working on launching a new platform, which is actually called Fossil Banks No Thanks, where we will also showcase what organizations around the world are doing on pressuring banks on fossil fuels. So we're sort of creating like a window where we show all of the different actions going on and enabling people to get in touch with each other, make connections. So really sort of, continuing to build the movement also. I think 10 years ago, maybe it was really super niche to be working on banks and the stuff that they finance. It's not so niche anymore, but it's still a movement that really needs to build and people that need to connect to each other. So that's also something that we'll be working on.
Thank you, Maaike. I guess I should have said that COP, for anybody who doesn't know, is the annual UN Climate Summit, and it was postponed last year because of COVID. Keith, any comments about the upcoming COP conference before we close and go to Ken?
Yeah, so I think there's going to be a lot of focus on finance in the lead up to the meeting in Glasgow. These are always big things. Now, these are actually meetings of governments, right? Like the COP is a moment when governments get together to talk about, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and sort of what's happening under that. And it's a big question is going to be on raising the level of ambition around 2030 targets and sort of working out some of the details of how that is done. One of the really important questions under discussion right now is on whether or not you're going to be able to, you will be able to count as kind of like credits towards offsets, where, and like from Greenpeace's perspective, we just don't think there should be offsets, basically, because it's a way of like avoiding reducing emissions. But
Agreed.
But I do think there's going to be there'll be a sort of bigger focus than ever before on the finance sector in the lead up to it. And there's going to be sort of broad pressure, banks, insurers, investors. And to be honest, I don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, because everyone's plans are still somewhat in flux because the damn thing keeps getting delayed. And we're hoping, it'll actually happen in this year. Or at least some kind of meeting will happen, but it's been a strange year. I mean, that meeting was supposed to happen during the pandemic and got canceled. So,
yes.
But I do think finance is going to have a bigger role than ever before, and it's not going to be, just Canada. Or it's going to be like it's a global push.
Great. Well, thank you both. That was wonderful. And I'll turn you over to Ken and mute myself.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen. Maaike, I'd like to put a couple slides up of the BankTrack website, because it's incredible, the depth of information, and just remarkable. And I'd like you just to talk even more about it. Just let me get the slide up. Um, would you like to define dodgy deals for us as a start?
Yeah, of course. So I think dodgy deals are basically projects that are controversial either because they have adverse human rights impacts or negative environmental climate consequences. And they are financed in full or in part by banks. And we keep quite a big database of such dodgy deals, also because, 2.7 trillion of financing by 35 banks into 2,100 fossil fuel companies is really abstract. It makes you go like, but if you know that, for example, companies are providing loans to the company called Enbridge behind the Line 3 pipeline project, that makes it much more concrete. It brings you much closer to the people that are feeling the impact of those projects on the ground. So it's both a way to just sort of give a bit of face to the abstract numbers that we were talking about, and also a really good way to pressure banks, because when you talk to a bank, they always like to talk about the abstract, the general sort of policy, say, oh, we have such an amazing policy on, and then they throw all these technical terms at you. But when you say, oh, but listen, you're actually financing this coal mine in Poland, what do you have to say about that? Then you have a whole different conversations, and they can also no longer deny the negative consequences that they are having. So I think it's an effective tool both for people to better understand what we're really talking about when we say certain bank financing is problematic, but also effective in pushing the banks.
I think that's a very important point, that you quantify. The BankTrack just quantifies every project, hundreds, I don't know how many, maybe thousands of projects that you've got on the BankTrack website, and for every one, exactly how much money is being loaned or by what banks. And of course, you look at a pipeline, you'll have 20 or 30 banks all contributing millions and millions of dollars. And of course, they'd rather just have you look at the greenwashing, not look at the reality. This is, I noticed that I was looking through the all the BankTrack dodgy deals, and I noticed even there were wind projects that had been cited in places where they hadn't gotten proper permissions from the locals and such. So BankTrack doesn't hold back on that.
Yeah, and I think there it's always also important to remember sort of the overlap that climate impacts and human rights impacts can have. And usually that shows up when you're talking about fossil fuel projects like pipelines and coal mines, etc. But the same can be true for renewable energy projects. So that's, of course, also a really important component if we think of moving away from fossil fuels, where are we moving, and the just transition that should be. So that is something that's really important to remember always.
So here's an example of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. That's one of the important ones in Canada, the fracking in northeast BC and going to Kitimat, and some people are pretty unhappy with that. But here, this is just the start of the list of all of the banks and what investments they actually have. And also here, this is actually the governance. So each one of these on the screen for each of the banks, The climate blueprint, of course, is the Royal Bank's greenwashing. The statement on climate change is the Bank of Montreal's greenwashing. Responsible financing and the green chair, Keith, are Toronto Dominion's TD Bank, etc. Then, of course, you've done the BankTrack website also has quite a few specific reports that have been done recently. I was wondering if you were involved with or you knew much about the recent one on coal, Maaike, that was released, and I think was no doubt BankTrack had an important role in.
You mean the global coal exit list?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the global coal exit list was released last week, if I'm correct. And this is produced by a German organization called Urgewald. And that is a really fantastic resource. It's really impressive. And it's a lot more focused. So they basically have an almost comprehensive list of companies involved in the coal value chain. And then they also look at which financial institutions finance those companies. So because it's focused on coal, it's really detailed. And what's really great about that resource is that, of course, we can use it as activists, but banks also use this resource because it's such a great list of companies involved in coal. Banks use it as a list to sort of make decisions on their own financing. So I think that's an example of if you as an NGO are doing such sort of comprehensive and well thought through research, that can really have an impact. So
I know in that coal report,
doing that. It's
I know in the coal, sorry. I know in the coal report, they were actually calling out Canada and the UK because those were the two countries that led the end of coal campaign at the Paris Agreement. And both of them are supporting there's new coal plants being approved in both the UK and Canada. So a little bit shameful. I want to show one more slide. Oh, there's the greenwashing for TD. Oh, sorry, I thought I had one more. Where is it? This slide shows on the right, for each issue and each bank, you've got this whole list down the right. Maybe you could talk a bit about that. So as you can see, I've just clicked on governance, but the amount of data for every project is just remarkable. Maybe you could just talk to that list a little bit.
Yeah, so what we try to do is, if in this case you have a project, the coastal gaslink pipeline, so we have a bit of general information about what the project is. And then under financiers, we try to keep as much data as we have about the banks that finance either the project or the company behind the project. So because it's not always the case that a project is financed specifically, sometimes banks are providing loans to a company, sort of general loans, and that company can then use it for a project. So we look at both where relevant, sort of. And of course, this financing data is never comprehensive, but we try to keep an overview that's as comprehensive as possible. But there's always more. And then under companies, I don't know if you can probably not click on it. We sort of try to keep an cross-link between the companies that are then involved in the specific project. So you can always click from a project, then to the companies that are involved, and then to the financiers of that company. So it sort of all triangulates to each other. And then I think documents and news are always relevant. So that's where we keep bank documents. So for example, if the Royal Bank of Canada has a governance document that regulates their activities in this area, then we'll post it there. So people can also go to the bank website and see what policies are relevant.
Okay, thank you, Maaike. I think that gives a flavor of what's there, but as you can see, there's 3 or 4 more categories and every one of them is full of well-referenced information. I'd like to go now to a couple of questions from the audience. This is from Lynn Ovenden. If I invest in my bank's green bond, am I supporting its loans to the fossil fuel industry? Keith, do you want to address that?
So green bonds are a big new thing where you're trying to actually get together pools of capital to fund good stuff. And in Europe, there's actually pretty tight criteria on what can be called a green bond. In Canada, they're being sneaky. So the Canadian banks want to actually call them transition bonds, whereby what they can do is they can simply relabel their loans to oil and gas companies and coal companies as they're helping them transition to a low carbon future.
Where have I heard that before?
So I would, we would argue that you should, if you're going to have a green bond, you have to have it like really tight definition. It can only be for these types of low carbon activities. It should not be for, helping Suncor put in a new cogeneration plant or something like that at their oil sands mine. So part of this is definitional, but I think like if you have a good definition of a green bond, it is helpful towards funding kind of that alternative future. And with all of this finance stuff, we also have to say, really ultimately we need government policies that will drive the major investment decisions, infrastructure being built, et cetera. But those types of green bond things, I think, they can be positive. We just have to make sure that they don't sneak in all sorts of dirty stuff in and then call it green.
Thank you. Question here from Lynn Adamson about how much of the focus we should have on bank financing versus the insurance issue, because I know people like Stop the Money Pipeline often target the insurers. Would either of you like to address that for a minute?
I think different parts of the financial industry are all important. So I would be all for targeting all. So I think what makes banks a bit different is that they often have quite long-term relationships with what they call their clients. Whereas insurance, on the other hand, they often own shares. So they actually own a part of the company. So they both have influence over, leverage over the company, but in a different way. So I think, targeting both makes a lot of sense, is important.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think it is important to target both, but I think sort of different techniques are going to work differently for them each. So you can't just have a campaign. Well, I think it's best not to have one campaign that's trying to go at banks and insurance companies exactly the same way with the same sort of tactics. You actually have to sort of figure out where are the weak spots of each of these relatively, what causes them pain, and then inflict that pain in a way that moves them in the right direction.
Thank you. I'd like to ask both of you about stranded assets a little more, because it seems like a key issue. I would say it's 2 or 3 years ago, there were 2 or 3 very detailed reports about the risk, maybe it was even 4 or 5 years, about the risks of stranded assets. And I'm just surprised that the banks continue to make these bets, because if my understanding of these stranded asset reports is they really are making a bet. They're playing roulette with these investments. I'd like to know what you think of that. Either of you, Maaike, would you like to address that?
No, go ahead, Keith.
So to come back to one of Maaike's points, the banks have very short-term perspectives. So stranded assets aren't a risk in the next 5 years. It's more 15, 20, 25 years out that where stranded asset risk really kicks in strongly. So, if you talk to people in the finance sector, they're like, oh, I don't care what happens in 10 years. That's forever in my books. And so they think we could get out before then, even though they're continuing to sort of fund this stuff now that's putting infrastructure in the ground that's going to be here for 50 years. But can I try sharing my screen? I'm not sure if this is set up so I'll be able to, but I just want to show one thing. So this is something I was just reading this morning. And it's from a company called Rystad Energy. They're an energy consultancy firm. They are not environmental eco guys at all. They're like hardcore, how do we make as much money by maneuvering things in the energy sector. And they put out a report on February 19th saying, how are oil companies navigating the energy transition? And they looked at portfolio resilience. And so what this graph shows is basically their exposure to risk if the car companies actually achieve their electric vehicle targets. So this is not a 1.5 scenario. This is not, sort of a crazy thing. It's just like, if Ford and GM and Volvo and everybody go electric as fast as they say they'll go electric, what does that do to oil demand? What does it do then to the price of oil, et cetera? And they look at all the various companies in terms of how much at risk, the value of the company is at risk. And what's interesting is, so the bottom is the revenue risk, like how much if the price of oil drops and going up is like how much is basically how high is the carbon price and the risk from a carbon price. And you'll sort of see if you're in the green, you're kind of like, you're probably mostly okay as you go out. And the outlier by far, way out here, is oil sands company. This is Suncor and Canadian Natural Resources Limited. They're in the top 25 oil companies globally that they were looking at. And this, remember, like, as Rolly was saying, 5 of the 6 largest financiers in the world of oil sands companies are the big 5 Canadian banks. And for historical reasons that we go into another time, Canadian banks are overexposed in mining and oil and gas globally, but particularly here in Canada. So when we're looking at stranded asset risk, the risk appears first in high carbon, high cost oil, which is the oil sands. They're like the highest cost, highest carbon, basically. And that's why I think, like, for Canadian banks, they're actually they're more exposed than many other global peers. And it's something that we also have to get out there so that they start hearing from kind of shareholders and from investment analysts, okay, what's your strategy for dealing with this? You guys are at higher risk. So I'll stop sharing there. But I just came across actually this, I was reading this report this morning and I thought, oh, this is relevant for our discussion today, because it's that asset, that risk of stranded asset, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it is going to happen within the lifetime of existing investments.
Well, I think all of those pipelines and anything you're putting in the ground now, even the payoff for them is 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It's not.
And the de facto plan right now is let the taxpayers deal with it. Companies go bankrupt, hand it back to the government, clean up the mess. And there's entire communities in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland that will be devastated if we don't actually have a plan to transition in a fair way and a just way off of oil onto renewables.
Thank you. Rolly, did you want to ask any other questions, or do you want to go into, you're getting close to the end of the time. Do you want to go into your slides about the Canadian?
Yeah, I could. There's just one question, though, that I think is very important to address. And that was actually the very first question that went up in the Q&As, and that was from Lynn Ovenden. And but she's saying, sorry, that's not the one. Hang on. Maybe it is. Well, I can't find it right now. But anyway, the question was about if I invest with my bank's, green mutual funds. Does that mean that I'm investing green? And the answer to that might be sort of a yes and no. Sure, it's better, as Keith was saying, it's better to invest in a green mutual fund. But the fact is, you're still with a bank that uses its profits, or that profits from financing fossil fuels. So there's sure a way to get around that, of course, is to not be with one of the big 5 banks, be with an ethical bank. And this way, any investment you have with the bank is green. So that's it for that question. So you wanted me to go to... I'll
put some slides up for you.
Yeah, okay, let's wrap up because it's 2 o'clock very quickly.
Where you want to start?
Not particularly. I just put that one in there because I like the little guy. That's all. So we can just move along.
Sorry.
No, we're not going to deal with those. Just keep going. I just want to get to the one where I'd like Maaike to comment on this particular slide, because one of the things, of course, that the report does, that the Banking and Climate Change reports they evaluate policy scores from different banks. And what I've done with this particular slide here is I've taken that whole table or chart and I've taken the top 10 and I've put the bottom 10 to show how banks are performing on the policy score issue. And maybe Maaike has something to say about that, but if you'll notice, at the very, very bottom on the total policy scores, Canada's big 5 banks in that circle, they're all in there. So in other words, not only do we have 17.5% of fossil fuel expansion financing, since the Paris Agreement, we are almost not on the scale in terms of formulating policy to deal with climate and future investments and so on. I just wanted to show that one. And since we're at 2 o'clock, I just wanted to take a minute, if I could, to say that I'm finished with the slides for now. I think that Keith will probably want to talk to one slide. I'm kind of skipping over a few things, but if you wanted to show Keith's slide, which will be just below the funny guy with the oil barrels. That one there. So Keith, do you want to talk to that for a second? Because I'm putting a link up for that in the chat group.
Great, thanks a lot. So this is a petition we're running right now to tell Canadian banks to stop funding fossil fuel companies. This is kind of like, you think of it as like the opening salvo. As you know, they will see the petition. We're trying to find people who are interested in this issue so we can start developing a relationship with them and also kind of like send them more information, bring them along, get them involved in later steps. It's kind of like how we do things. And so, you know, if you're interested, please do sign up. We're also doing some social media testing right now where we're sort of like trying out different tweets and Instagram things and little videos to, again, it's partially to sort of see what kind of grabs people's attention, because it's really important, I think, when we're doing this work to not just sort of think like, oh, everyone should know this and sort of just keep hammering them with that. You got to find, okay, what are things that actually really appeal to them that you can sort of like engage them, get their attention, bring them along, and make them feel a part of it. And also sort of it's kind of like an interactive process. But this is a petition we've got going right now. And we're trying to sort of build up a base of, you know, supporters who are really interested in banks and want to help us put that pressure on the banks so that as we start planning things like die-ins or whatever we're going to do once weather's a little warmer and COVID is less of a risk, hopefully, we've kind of got that kind of like base of people who are keen on this. And it's, yeah, so it's first step, and I think it's going to be a really fun campaign, and I think the banks are a really good target right now.
Thank you, Keith. So Ken, I'm just going to mention also that across Canada right now, we have a group, we've kind of called ourselves Fossil Bank No Thanks. But anyways, we're a group that just sort of, you know, organically, spontaneously came together. We've been meeting now for several months. And so far we've had 2 actions. One was on January 29th, which was a National Action Day. It was very, very successful. It was mostly digital and online stuff, a little bit of in-person stuff going on, I believe, in Vancouver and Toronto. But because of COVID, it was primarily digital. There was also a digital campaign last Friday on February 25th when the Cole report came out, the Ergenwald report came out, and also it coincided with RBC's press release about how green it is and net zero emissions by 2050 and so on. And this group, and I'd just like to mention who's in this group. It involves people from 350.org, people from For Our Kids, people from XR Extinction, smaller organizations like Below 2C and the Climate Pledge. There's NGOs, I'm just going from my paper, Lead Now, Bank Track, Greenpeace Canada, that I mentioned, Fridays for Future, Shift Action. So a whole bunch of people who, great organizers. I'm kind of coordinating this, but all the organizers are very much part of actions going forward. Some of the dates to remember: March 19th is the Global Climate Strike. There'll be a focus on finance this year. This is the first time that a global climate strike. This is what the you know that happens under Greta's leadership. There'll also be March 24th is the release of the next climate banking on climate change report, and I know that we're going to have some online activities to support that, and also to continue to expose the banks, which the next report will reveal as villains, I suppose. And then the AGM season is starting. Ironically, the TD is having its AGM on April the 1st. So someone came up with, we have to have a fossil fuel day to point the finger. I love it. Fossil fuel day to point the finger at TD. They couldn't have picked a worse date, right? But anyways, so we're working going forward. This group is very encouraged by the fact that Greenpeace Canada is on board as well, Lead Now and BankTrack, and it's a fun group to be with. The last slide, if you can put it up, it's tools to move your money. And this is a slide, I've shared a bunch of links in the chat, and these are links to pages on Below 2C that will help anyone who is thinking of moving their money or firing their fossil bank or switching banks. And anyways, I've shared the links, and there are different sample letters you can use in there. The steps to follow are all, there are 5 steps to follow in order to do this. And there's also a page that lists credit unions and some banks that are, not all banks are fossil banks. There are some banks that are fossil-free banks. So there are alternatives to the big 5. And of course, there's contact information. And I'll stop there, Ken, because I see that we're quite a bit over.
Rolly, thank you. I just want, you might just mention, because it was one of the questions, is who are you recommending moving your money to, if not the big 5 banks in Canada?
Well, again, there's a link in there that will show, if not the big banks, then who. I don't want to, I myself have divested from the Royal Bank. I've been working at that now for months. And I've gone to the Desjardins group, but I don't want to recommend anyone. There are a lot of very, very large credit unions on there that are totally fossil free. So personally, I recommend credit unions, and the Desjardins group fits into that category. But there's also Van City out of Vancouver, Meridian, and so on. So if you go to that link, there's a whole page full of different credit unions across Canada.
Okay, thanks, Rolly.
Okay.
So I think we should bring this to a close in a minute. I'm just wondering, Maaike, did you have any last thoughts you'd like to share with us? I noticed one thing that in the Paris Agreement, not only do they not mention the words fossil fuels, I'm sure they don't mention banks or investment either. Because of course, that's exactly, if they don't mention fossil fuels, then how could you mention getting banks out of fossil fuels? But anyway, a final comment, Maaike, on whatever you would like to say.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know, maybe just to encourage people to, even if it feels a bit daunting sometimes, even just tweeting your bank or sending them a message or calling your bank manager is really helpful. So small steps is really where it starts. And otherwise, I think more people can get involved with the group and with Greenpeace Canada, the better.
Keith?
Well, I want to thank sort of the organizers for pulling this together, but also the amazing work you've done in sort of kicking off a bunch of this work. I do really think I've spent the last kind of 12 years of my life fighting pipelines. And I kind of feel like banks are the new pipelines in terms of like a vulnerable place where we can actually put real pressure on the fossil fuel industry, but also on government to step up their game. So looking forward to this, and I think we're going to have a fun few years pushing banks around.
Great, thanks. I just want to mention one more thing before we go. Our very first Time4Action webinar 6 weeks ago was with Elizabeth May and Ken Love, and they were talking about Bill C-12. We thought we had a very interesting discussion. They were both very knowledgeable. Just in the last few days, the Liberal government announced for that Bill C-12, advisory committee, and both Ken Love and Elizabeth May put out very terse statements, very upset with what had happened. First of all, they still don't have a 2025 reporting year, which is ridiculous. It makes the bill completely useless because this is the decade we really need to cut fossil fuels. But also, Elizabeth May said only one scientist, one IPC scientist on the board, and it should be a bunch. Secondly, the board was chosen by the Liberal government as opposed to really being independent folks. And then Ken Love, I'm going to put in when we send out the link to the webinar on YouTube for this webinar, I'll include their 2 comments, but just briefly for Ken Love, he said, it looks like that the committee will not have its own resources, its own scientists, or its own backup. It's going to be dependent on going to the Department of Environment and Climate Change when it wants work done, and also that the minister is going to be able to direct them in what things they want answered, as opposed to them really doing whatever they think needs to be done. So you can be sure they'll be dissuading them from focusing on the urgency of getting rid of investments, from stopping banks from investing in fossil fuel infrastructure, for example. And I'll leave it at that. So I'd just like to thank all 3 of our guests. I think it's been very informative. It's very disturbing, but it's obviously a very key piece to moving this dealing with this climate crisis. We're just not stepping up to the plate yet on investment, and that's just, I hope at the COP26 they talk about that or move to do something. I know Sephora Berman and Stand.Earth are involved in an initiative to get rid of, a treaty to agree to stop the proliferation of fossil fuels. Anyway, I'd like to thank Keith Stewart, Maaike Bennes, and our own Rolly Montpellier for an interesting session. Thanks so much. Kathleen, any last word from you?
Well, I think we need to promote next week's webinar because it's a little along the same lines, except it's about pensions. And who wants to be supporting fossil fuels through your pensions? I mean, after listening to this last hour, we're almost caught in, no matter what we do in our society, we seem to be helping a system that's destroying us. But anyway, we have 2 excellent people next week, and so we hope you can come and hear the rest. It's sort of the sequel. If you're worried about what your money's doing, please join us again next week. And thank you to our guests very, very much, and viewers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maaike.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Keith.
Okay, we will put out the YouTube link in the next day or 2. And we look forward to, thanks for everyone who came, and we look forward to seeing you next week. I think Adam and Patrick are also very experienced climate campaigners like Keith, and in Canada, and they're doing some great work on the pension issue. Finances are important in many ways. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Bye for now.